All right, welcome everyone, except Rob. Not welcome, Rob. So we're here today to talk about GitHub Codespaces. To get an idea, how many people here are already using GitHub Codespaces? And dev containers? Great. So it's a bit of an introductory session, so sorry. But before I dive into the session, let's talk about the most important thing. These are the people that not only give us swag and are very nice to talk to, but also they sponsor the event. So a big thank you to our sponsors. I got some advice from our friendly people in the back, our AV folks. If anyone falls asleep in this session, they told me to throw these canaries. If you want one of these canaries, you can also just ask me. You don't have to pretend to fall asleep. So there we go. A little bit about myself. My name is Jaap. I'm not from around here. I'm based out of Amsterdam. I do a fair bit with PowerShell. And I'm also a developer advocate at Harness. And when I'm not talking about PowerShell, I like to play around with it, script, blog, or prepare my presentations. Welcome. There's still seats in the front. No problem. So what we'll be covering today are a couple of things. So we'll talk a bit about why we would want to use GitHub Codespaces, or why we would want to use dev containers. We'll talk a bit about containers and dev containers, what it means, and then we'll progress from there to GitHub Codespaces. I have a bunch of demos, and I was told not to go over time, so we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards, and yeah, just a giveaway. So we are a small group, so if you have any questions or comments, or you feel free to interrupt me either by raising your hand or just shouting at me. That it works both ways. So the why. For me, there's a couple of reasons why you would want to use containers or GitHub Codespaces. And a couple of reasons are that if you're working within a team, or you yourself are trying to get started with a new project, the onboarding part and getting yourself ready to start developing and delivering code can be a cumbersome process. With PowerShell, a little bit less than with other programming and scripting languages. But if you have dependencies on certain tools or modules that need to be available, modules is of course also something we have at PowerShell, then it can be useful to create a dev container, and whenever you or someone else starts to work on the project or resumes to work on the project, they can just connect directly to this container, have all their tools available, have everything up to date and configured for the specific project, so you can get started right away. And the reason this is a better way is because I've also tried different ways of doing this throughout my career. So from writing documentation for my colleagues to tell them what they need, to creating scripts they need to run that will install all the dependencies. But then you get to the point where your scripts might be out of date, or the script doesn't work the way you want it to work. So you end up with a lot more administrative work. And one of the key things why I do like PowerShell and why I do like scripting is I want to find the easiest way to do things. So I can nap more. It's very important. The nap to work ratio should always be towards naps. Another reason for it is device compatibility. So I have a M1 Mac, so that's an ARM system. So not everything might run on this. Also, it runs. So that's on the chipset side of things. But on the other hand, it's also running Mac OS, so not Windows or Linux or with a specific flavor of Linux. Of course, you can cover this with virtualization and running a virtual machine on your system and then develop in there. But virtual machines for development, it might have its use cases, but I think containers are a better fit here. And one of the things that's what really triggered me to start doing more with Codespaces is, in particular with WSL. Is everyone familiar with WSL? Okay, I see a lot of nodding. So the Windows subsystem for Linux, I always mess them up if it's the Linux subsystem for Windows or the other way around, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, I was not aware of that. So for people listening to this recording later on, it was mentioned that it's for legal reasons that it's called the Windows subsystem for Linux and not the other way around. So learned something new today. And the other reason can be performance. So I was unlucky enough during one of my trips to get my laptop stolen because I thought putting it in the trunk of a car was a fantastic idea. Other people also thought it was a fantastic idea and they took my laptop instead of me. So then I traveled with a Surface Go for a while, and a Surface Go is a great small portable device. I didn't have to put it in the trunk of a car. I could put it in my pocket and always keep it with me. So I covered my bases there. But the downside of it is, if you're trying to, well, let's give the example of the thing that takes the most time in PowerShell, running your test suite, because we all write PowerShell tests, right? Pester test, love it, hate it? Thank you, thank you. I know it's early in the morning. I also didn't have a coffee here yet, so. You get a canary, by the way, audience participation. Yeah, sorry, that's... Yeah, I was going to be a baseball star, but I don't know what happened. So those are some of the key reasons. There are more reasons to use dev containers, but I think these are the main ones that I find particularly useful. So any questions so far? Carry on. Let's talk about containers. So what are containers? So containers are just yet another abstraction layer that we place on top of our operating system. So works on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, can install Docker. The easiest way to get started if you've never used Docker before is with Docker Desktop. And then you can containerize, in this case, your applications, but you can also place your development environment inside a container. And the advantage of that is that you can then directly connect to these containers using Visual Studio Code. And this is also possible it's also possible to set this up to either VS Code or to Docker Desktop. And the reason I talk about containers now is to give a little bit of an understanding of how GitHub Codespaces works, because what GitHub Codespaces is just running these containers, not yourself, but having GitHub run them for you. So for VS Code dev containers, this one is slightly out of date because it's no longer called .NET Core. It's just .NET nowadays. These are a couple of example dev containers that you can get started with. And because just showing screenshots is a bit boring, I'll do some demos and see if I can make things fail. Cool. I don't really have a way to zoom in, so I'll just talk whenever I click on things to give you an understanding of what we're doing here. So first things first, I'll go to VS Code. So what I have here is one of the dev containers. I can make this one bigger. One of the dev containers, and this is a .NET web application. And I'll go over to the Docker desktop. And what we can see here, that if we take a look at the containers we have running here, is we can see that we have a container running here. And if we go into the logs, let's see, we can see which .NET version we're running. It might be a little bit small, but it's 7.3. So I already set this one up because it takes about 2 minutes for all the dependencies to be downloaded and to be installed locally. But one of the powerful things here is if you would be running this application already on your system, or you're trying to test new functionality, the fact that you're running it inside of the container also means that the ports that are exposed, because this web application can be redirected to your local host, so you can run multiple instances of this same container without it interfering with others. So to show that, what we'll do is let's open up the link. Where's the clicky? There we go. So we can see that even though we're running this application inside of a container, through VS Code we can port forward this to port 5000. So if we go back to VS Code and change this, we can also put a different port here. I will skip over that one. So if you want to create your own development environment, what you can do is you can either do it through VS Code, and that's just by doing dev container. You can see that we can just create a dev container from here. But I'll go to the visual route of using Docker Desktop. This does require having a up-to-date version of Docker Desktop because it's relatively new. And if we create one, we get two options. We can either connect to an existing Git repository or a local directory. And in this case, I'll just go for my own repository. So I'll go for Jaap Brasser, so that's just my GitHub profile. There isn't a whole lot of code there, but that's not really the point. The idea is to show you how easy it is to just spin up anything inside of a dev container. So now we have it, and we can see that there's also a button there, and we can directly open it in VS Code, and that should work. And then what we can see, it has already cloned the entire repository inside my container. And the reason I picked this one is because it comes with a lot of pictures of cute animals. And I think, Barbara, do we have your dog in here as well?
I don't think I uploaded.
So me and Barbara are also running a GitHub and DevOps user group, and we call it DDoG. So one of the things we do there is have people upload pictures of their pets to my GitHub repository. So it's my favorite repository. But this is just to illustrate how you can use Docker Desktop to create these dev containers, and also connect to them using VS Code. Now the question is, how do I get rid of this? There we go. Sweet. Yep.
Functionality you get in addition to using Docker Desktop versus opening the repo in VS Code and then telling it to open it in a code space or in a local dev container?
Well, if you open it up in a code space, then you get additional. So the question is there a difference between opening it up to Docker Desktop rather than to VS Code, and then either locally or in code spaces? So the benefit you get of opening it in code spaces is that you can choose what kind of operating system, what kind of hardware, and even what kind of chipsets. I think, do you know that, Barbara? Is ARM supported on Codespaces, or is it just X? Yeah. 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 So the question is there something different in opening it to Docker Desktop or to VS Code? I haven't found a difference yet. There might be a difference if anyone knows. Okay, I'll have to get back to you on that one if there is a difference. I haven't found any difference in doing it either way. Let's see. And with that, we've reached Codespaces. So the idea of Codespaces is that you now have an understanding of what containers are, but you might not want to install Docker on your desktop because it is your own desktop, or you might not have your work laptop because you left it in the office because you like to keep work and life separate, and you might actually go to the office. I know some of us do, some of us don't. Then having access to Codespaces can be quite useful because you can directly connect to these containers that are run by GitHub. So you have, aside from having VS Code installed with a plugin for containers, you don't need to have Docker. You don't need to have any containers running on your system. So that is the instantly part. And already covered that. So it is run by GitHub. We have support for multiple languages, and when we talk about languages here, we are talking about programming languages. The ones that are not supported out of the box, one of them is PowerShell. There's no default container for PowerShell, but you can install anything in these containers because they're hosted by GitHub, but you can completely customize them and install whatever kind of tools or functionality that you want by either manually doing it, or if you're doing it properly, creating a setup script or defining it in the JSON. And we'll go over some of those configuration options in the next demo. So you can use this to customize your containers to specific projects. So an example that we'll go into, I was using WSL, WSL1 on my development box, and if you've ever used WSL and you try to copy the normal Linux commands you find in all the tutorials or getting started guides for different products, it might not work exactly the same way. You might need quotation marks where on Windows where you don't need them on Linux, or the other way around. So not being a Linux engineer, I ended up wasting a lot of time on that. And that was my first use case for GitHub Codespaces, because I needed to build one of my applications in Linux, a Node.js app. But getting it up and running on WSL, I spent 2 hours to make it work, and then I kind of forgot the steps I'd taken to make it work the previous time, and then I had to do it again. Then I thought maybe this is something for GitHub Codespaces, and I could just select which Linux distro I wanted. I could tell it to install all the packages, all my dependencies, and then from that moment on, whenever I needed to build this project, do an update to it, all I needed to do was open up my code space, and I could hit the ground running. All I needed to do is throw in some new data, rebuild it, and I'd be good to go. So that's been a huge time saver. Additional functionality is that you can sync your personal settings. So personal settings like the kind of extensions you have installed. So if you're using GitHub Codespaces, you have two options. You can either connect your VS Code directly, you can connect your Codespace to VS Code, or you can run it in the browser. When you run it in the browser, you get a web-based version of VS Code, either with all your extensions or the extensions that you specify for the project. So you can customize your image. You do that through JSON. We talked about the VS Code settings already. And because you can define this on a per project basis or even on a specific branch basis, it can be pretty quick to onboard for new contributors, or in my case, when I was the only contributor, it would be a lot faster for me because I didn't have to figure out how to run WSL. So that saved a lot of time. I wanted to call it Start Codespaces, but we can't use plural because it's PowerShell, so it has to be an approved verb and a singular noun, so Start Codespace. In order to get started with Codespaces, you need a GitHub account. It is free, or at least it's free if you use it for personal use, so you don't use it in your work org. You get it free for up to 60 hours, and the 60 hours if you use a 2-core system. After that, it's 9 cents current prices, and this is dollar cents, so it will fluctuate. 9 cents per core per hour, and the smallest container that you can get is 2 cores, so it's 18 cents an hour. The biggest one you can get is 32, so that's 32 times 9, and I'm not going to embarrass myself calculating that. I think it's 280 something. And by doing so, you can run your code from anywhere. So you can access this container through your browser, any kind of Chromium browser, so Edge, Chrome, any of the other ones are fully supported there. And you can manage your dependencies, you can manage your extensions all within Codespaces rather than having to rely on your local environment. And that also takes away one of my pain points, and that is whenever I switch a device or I lose a device because I'm not very smart, I need to set up my Git again, configure it, and then I need to look up to my own notes because I always forget what I need to set up to get my Git up connected correctly, to set up my signing keys to make sure that it can be traced back to me. Then the part that I already talked about and showed before in VS Code with the port forwarding. The port forwarding can also be set up for Codespaces. So if you're running something in a Codespace, you can also redirect those ports so you can access whatever you're running there. Once again, in the case of PowerShell, unless you're running Universal Dashboard, there's probably not a lot of web ports that you're using, but I know that there are some exceptions here in the audience, so that can be valuable. So with that, I am going to go into the next demo, unless there's any questions about this. Does anyone want a canary? No canaries. I brought a whole army here. They're meant to fly. And I've already proven that I can't hit anyone, even if I try. Cool, let's go for our last demo of the day. After that, it's lunchtime, by the way. It's very hard to get you people excited. It's almost lunchtime. Yeah, I could go for some coffee. I saw one of you walk in with a giant cup of coffee, and yeah, I'm jealous. You're a smarter person than I am. So what we can see here, I'm on github.com. I can take a look at my Codespaces. This is actually the example I gave before. So this is my Node.js documentation generation repository. Because I don't like writing documentation, I just want it automatically generated. So it's not as user-friendly, but it gets the job done. Let's see. So we can see now that we're connected to this code space. It's starting it up. And what we can see here is that we are running it in the browser now, but we just get the full VS Code experience there. We do have to wait for the code space to start up. So, and the way it works with Codespaces, if you disconnect your session or it's inactive for I think between 15 and 30 minutes, it will automatically shut down and stop running. So that is the default option. So what we can see here is we have. Well, we can't really see it because it's kind of small, but we can see that we have multiple branches here. And if we go to our files, we can see that all the files are here. We have our specification, and if I wanted to build my application now, I could do that directly from here. With that, let's open up Codespaces again. Let's go to my generate docs. So you can see it's active now because we started it by clicking on it. Nothing too exciting there. You can see that the default was that we open it up in the browser, but maybe we just want to continue in VS Code itself. So what we can do is we go to Visual Studio Code. We get a warning that code might run. And we can see that we're now going to connect to our GitHub Codespace in VS Code. So that's pretty transparent in how you can do that. And if we switch back to the browser, we can also stop it from here, and then we get a upset VS Code. Let's see. So we can see the Codespace has been stopped. But at least I'm not spending my 60 hours, so I save myself a bit of money or give myself a bit more room. So we can either restart it, but this was just to demonstrate how we can do that. And with that, we're exactly at 30 minutes, so I'm very glad with my timing. So with Codespaces, we hear a lot of things these days about cloud first or everything in the cloud. I don't think moving everything to the cloud makes sense, but I think for specific workloads, it might make sense to start using GitHub Codespaces, or at least if you're like me and you don't have any real hobbies, then you can play around with it, learn about the new tech. So that's also how I got started with it. You get better compatibility because you can choose your operating system, chipset, all that kind of jazz. So you could even spin up a code space that runs your project in Linux or runs your unit tests in Linux. So you can just see directly if your code is going to run on a different operating system. Did a fair bit of cross-platform development for PowerShell as well. And there's not a whole lot of exceptions, but enough that sometimes you want to test it. And I think Codespaces can help out there. Mentioned onboarding, you make it easier to get started. Can be in a collaborative sense, but it can also be when you're like me and Sometimes you just forgot where you left off, and then having a code space, having a dev container that is in exactly the state you left it at is just a huge time saver, because at least you take the configuration, the dependency side out of the equation. And you can have managed, I say managed containers here, but you can manage the dev images for your teams, and you can do that from a central point, and you take away a developer messing up, setting up their own dependencies, so you can save time for other people as well. And with that, we have time for some Q&A.
The Docker dependency and the no you can use WSL and like one man and all those great different alternatives, but it still use that container WSL in that way. We cannot use Docker.
So your question is, you run,
Essentially, because the licensing restrictions and change for Docker,
yeah.
could I use the open source Red Hat Docker toolings instead of Docker?
I have not tried that. I'm not sure how that works within, you mean from VS Code? Or,
Essentially, if we can't use Docker,
yeah.
could we use maybe the Red Hat tooling, but it would probably have to work via WSL. I'm not sure if that would work.
Yeah, no, yeah, I also don't know. Yes.
So the question about the actual Git stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine that there are two people working on the same branch.
Yeah.
Do they all, each one has and they work in the browser, right?
Yeah.
Do they all have their own checkouts and they just work locally, or they already work on the branch in the remote?
No, so the branch is cloned into the dev container.
Okay.
So then you still have to push, pull, yep. The only time, and that's actually also going back to your earlier question, what the difference is to Docker Desktop, is you can start a dev container from Docker Desktop, where it syncs your local file system with the container. So that is one of the differences there. And then you wouldn't have to push, because there is no Git. So that is the only case in which that works. But that's only on your local system, and that's not for Codespaces. How you can do that, or? So if it's not installed there, you can either configure it in the JSON file, or you can put an install script in there. So I think if it's Linux, it's npm install. For Mac OS, it's brew cask import. I don't know the exact commands, but.
Codespaces, it's a VM behind the scenes, but still have the option to override and provide you a Docker file instead of Codespaces. Is that
right? So in Codespaces you can specify your own image as well. So if you would build your own image, or you would look in Docker Hub or any of the other online repositories, you look for an image, you can link that to your Codespace and use that as your base image, and then configure from there on out. So there's two ways. Either you connect to your Codespace and then you install PowerShell manually, or you put it in the configuration of which is either the JSON or one of the one of the initial installation scripts.
PGP of the Docker file that is purpose-based image that is cached, so to connect to it with their instantly does not freeze.
So I can show the repository here. Oh, I cannot show the repository here. So what we can see here, we have our Docker file, we have our dev container configuration. So you can see this has some of the extensions that are installed there, default shell. But if we go to setup, we can see that there's a couple of, let's see, a couple of tools being installed the moment the image gets rolled out. So you could also do a wget, get a PowerShell package and just install it within the container. I'd say lunchtime, and in my case, coffee time. Thank you very much for joining me.